Most people think the Kennedy tragedy begins with gunshots in Dallas, a president murdered in public, a glamorous family shattered on live television, a mother forced to watch her son become a national martyr. But by the time John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Rose Kennedy had already lived through something the public barely understood. Years earlier, one of her children had vanished from the family's polished story. Not through death, not through scandal, through something quieter, stranger, and in many ways more disturbing. Because before the Kennedys became America's most famous tragic dynasty, there was Rosemary Kennedy, the daughter, who did not fit, the procedure that never should have happened, and the silence that followed. And once you see what happened to Rosemary, it becomes much harder to tell where the family's tragedy really began. Rose Kennedy spent decades looking like the perfect American matriarch. Pearls, posture, discipline, 9 children, and a family so polished it almost seemed designed in advance for greatness. From the outside, the Kennedys did not look like ordinary people with ordinary problems. They looked inevitable, beautiful sons, elegant daughters. Money, political ambition, New England prestige, and the kind of camera-ready confidence that made them feel less like a household and more like an American dynasty already in progress. To the public, Rose was not just a mother. She was the woman who had helped build one of the most admired families in the country. But families like that do not just reward strength. They also define weakness very quickly. And in a house built around ambition, image, discipline, and relentless upward motion, weakness does not stay private for long. It becomes noticeable, then inconvenient, then dangerous, especially when the entire family story depends on the idea that everyone inside it is exceptional. The Kennedy children were not just raised to be loved. They were raised to matter. They were measured against one, another pushed toward achievement, and shaped by a family culture that did not leave much room for falling behind. That is what makes Rosemary Kennedy so important to this story. She was not just one tragic child among many. She was the first real fracture in the image, the first child whose existence forced the family to confront a problem that could not be solved with money, charm, or planning. Rosemary was warm, affectionate, and by many accounts deeply lovable. She could be cheerful, social, and sweet-natured. But as she grew up, it became clear that she was developing differently from her siblings. In another family, that might have led to patience, adaptation, or acceptance. In the Kennedy family, where comparison was constant and public image mattered more with every passing year, difference quickly became a problem to manage. And that is the word that hangs over Rosemary's life more than any other. Managed. Her schooling was managed. Her social life was managed. Her routines were managed. Her behavior was watched, corrected, and monitored through the lens of what it might mean for the family. The concern was never just Rosemary herself. It was what Rosemary represented inside a dynasty that was already beginning to think about power. Joe Kennedy was ambitious enough to imagine his sons in the highest offices in America. Rose Kennedy was disciplined enough to help build the atmosphere that could make those ambitions feel normal. Together, they created a family culture where a child who did not fit the design did not simply need help. She threatened the design itself. And once you understand that, the story starts to darken very quickly. Because the Kennedys were not merely successful. They were strategic. They understood image. They understood status. They understood the value of appearing strong, unified, and exceptional. That understanding would later help shape presidential campaigns, public perception, and one of the most powerful family myths in American history. But long before that myth reached the White House, it had already created a terrible pressure inside the home. Rosemary was the child who could not fully keep pace with the family's expectations, and that reality became harder to hide as she grew older. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the family's concerns about Rosemary had intensified. Some accounts described mood swings, struggles with independence, and growing fears that she might behave unpredictably in ways that could embarrass the family. whether those fears were exaggerated, misunderstood, or filtered through the brutal standards of the time. One thing is clear: Rosemary's life was increasingly being interpreted not as the life of a daughter with her own needs, but as a risk to the future of the Kennedy name. That shift is everything. It is the moment where the emotional logic of the family starts to reveal itself. The question was no longer simply how to support Rosemary. The question had become how to contain her. And then came the decision that would haunt the Kennedy story forever. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy underwent a lobotomy. Even now, that sentence lands with a kind of cold violence. It is impossible to hear it without feeling that something unforgivable has entered the room. The procedure was presented in that era as a modern solution for behavioral and mental difficulties. But in Rosemary's case, it was a disaster. It did not restore her. It destroyed much of what remained of her independence. Her speech, mobility, and functioning were all drastically damaged. Whatever difficult but living future she might have had was narrowed into something far smaller and more tragic. The daughter who had once laughed, danced, and tried to move through the world in her own imperfect way emerged from that procedure profoundly changed and permanently diminished. And then, just as disturbing as the procedure itself, came what followed. Silence. Not mourning in the open. Not public reckoning. Not a family forced to visibly carry the consequences of what had happened. Instead, Rosemary was institutionalized and gradually removed from the public story of the Kennedys. Her absence was not explained in any honest, fully visible way. The family moved forward. The image remained polished. The myth continued to build. And that is what makes Rosemary's story more than just a tragedy. It makes it a clue. Because once one daughter could be quietly absorbed into the background while the family kept climbing, it became clear that the Kennedy machine was built to survive almost anything except public imperfection. This is the point where Rose Kennedy becomes impossible to read in simple terms. She was not a cartoon villain. She was not some melodramatic monster without feeling. She was a mother, and by all accounts, a deeply structured, disciplined, religious woman who believed in endurance, propriety, and self-control. She almost certainly suffered. She almost certainly grieved. But grief and complicity are not opposites. A person can feel pain and still participate in a system that harms someone they love. Rose helped build the family atmosphere in which performance, order, and reputation mattered enormously. So whether she drove the decision, yielded to it, or simply lived inside the logic that made it possible, the aftermath still points to something chilling. After Rosemary's life was catastrophically altered, the family's public image remained intact. And that may be the first real sign that this story is not just about tragedy. It is about what kind of family this was, because a normal family might have been broken by something like that. A dynasty cannot afford to break. It contains, it redirects, it keeps moving. The Kennedys did exactly that. Rosemary's destruction did not stop the great family project. It disappeared beneath it. That hidden wound remained out of sight while the rest of the family surged forward into history. Which means that by the time the public first encountered the Kennedys as symbols of glamour, vigor, and political possibility, the darkest chapter in the family had already begun. And the family did keep moving. Joseph Kennedy Jr., the eldest son and original political heir, was the child Joe Kennedy had long imagined carrying the dynasty to its highest destination. Handsome, intelligent, confident, and groomed from the beginning for greatness, Joe Jr. was meant to be the family's first great political vessel. But in 1944, during World War II, he was killed when his aircraft exploded during a mission. He was only 29 years old. For many families, that kind of loss might have shattered the entire future they had imagined. For the Kennedys, it triggered something else. The dream did not end. It shifted. John was next. That transition says almost everything about how this family worked. One son dies, and another steps into position. The mission survives the child. The dynasty survives the grief. John F. John F. Kennedy, once seen as physically weaker and less central than his older brother, now inherited not just opportunity but expectation. The family project had lost its first heir, so it reorganized itself around the second. That is not just sad, it is revealing. It tells you how completely the Kennedys were built around continuity, ambition, and forward motion. Even disaster did not stop the machinery. It only rerouted it. The same pattern appears in the life of Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, one of the most vivid and charismatic of the Kennedy daughters. She was witty, socially gifted, and far more alive to pleasure and spontaneity than the stricter family image often suggested. But even Kathleen's story became another collision between individual life and family structure. Her marriage to a Protestant William Cavendish strained relations with Rose, whose Catholic convictions were serious and unbending. The marriage itself was brief. Cavendish died in World War II. Then, in 1948, Kathleen herself died in a plane crash in France. Another child, gone. Another beautiful life cut short. Another moment when private grief collided with a family trained to carry sorrow and elegant silence. By this point, the outline of the Kennedy story was already visible, though the public could not yet fully see it. One daughter, hidden after a catastrophic procedure. One son, dead in war. One daughter dead in a crash. And yet the family remained in motion, still rising, still presenting itself as composed, intact, and destined for greatness. That is what makes Rose Kennedy such a haunting figure. She was not merely enduring loss. She was enduring it inside a family system that had no real language for stopping, no real instinct for stepping outside the image, and no appetite for letting visible weakness interrupt the myth being built around them. That is where this first part of the story ends, because the next phase is the one most people think they already know. The son who was never meant to be the first heir becomes the face of a generation. The family's private discipline turns into public glamour. The Polish dynasty moves into the brightest spotlight in America, and only then, after the hidden wound has already been buried beneath the family image, do the tragedies become visible enough for the entire country to see. By the time John F. Kennedy stepped fully into history, the real Kennedy curse, if there was one at all, may have already been in place. Not as something supernatural, not as some mystical doom following the family from nowhere, but as something built much closer to home. Ambition without mercy, image without honesty, and a family so determined to appear perfect that one of its own had already been sacrificed before the world ever started watching. By the time John F. Kennedy became the brightest star in the family, the Kennedys had already survived enough private loss to break the image of most dynasties for good. But that was the strange thing about the Kennedy family. Tragedy did not seem to make them smaller. It made them look larger, more mythic, more fated. The deaths, the silences, the buried suffering did not destroy the aura. They fed it. And because the family carried itself with such discipline, such polish, and such confidence, the public often mistook control for strength and elegance for emotional health. For Rose Kennedy, John's rise must have looked like the clearest proof that the family project had worked. The son who had once stood behind Joe Jr. in the original order of importance was now moving toward the center of American life. He had the charisma, the war record, the wit, the intelligence, and the kind of face the camera seemed to adore. He looked young in a way American politics rarely did. He looked hopeful, modern, effortless, and as his public life accelerated, the whole family image rose with him. The Kennedys were no longer just a rich and ambitious clan from Boston. They were becoming something closer to American royalty, and that is exactly what makes the contrast so disturbing. Because while the country was beginning to see the Kennedys as a glamorous political family, Rosemary had already been removed from the frame. The daughter whose story should have raised moral questions about the entire family system was now mostly absent from the public imagination. The family's most devastating hidden wound was buried just as the family itself was becoming an object of national admiration. That timing matters. It means the myth did not grow despite the silence around Rosemary. In some ways, it grew on top of it. The White House years only deepened that split between image and reality. By the early 1960s, John and Jacqueline Kennedy had become not just political figures, but a cultural obsession. Youth, wealth, elegance, power, children on the lawn, televised charisma, a presidency that looked almost cinematic. The family was presented as a symbol of possibility. Even the setbacks and private realities that shadowed John's life were softened or hidden behind the public performance. His health problems were not fully known. His private recklessness was not fully known. The Kennedy image remained carefully controlled because everyone around it understood something essential. Once image and power fuse, the image becomes part of the power. That instinct was not new. It had already shaped Rosemary's fate years earlier. The family had learned long before the White House that weakness had to be managed, that damage had to be contained, and that the public version of the Kennedys mattered too much to let reality move freely across it. So when Americans later looked at Rose Kennedy and saw the perfect matriarch behind the perfect family, they were looking at a woman whose life had already been divided in two publicly. She was the mother of a president. Privately, she had already lived through the disappearance of a daughter from the family story in all but name. This is what gives John's rise such a strange emotional tone in hindsight. It feels triumphant, but it also feels haunted. The great family success arrived after one of the family's deepest moral failures had already taken place. That does not make John's success unreal. It makes it fragile. It makes it feel like something built on a foundation the public could not see. And then came Dallas. For the country, November 22nd, 1963, was the moment the Kennedy story turned from glamorous to tragic. That is the version history teaches in a single movement. There is America before the assassination, and America after it. There is Camelot, then the gunfire, then the funeral, then the nation's grief, freezing the family into legend. But for Rose Kennedy, the meaning of that day was more layered than it was for the public, because this was not the first time a child had been taken from her world in a catastrophic way. It was not even the second or third time. John's assassination was unspeakably large, but it landed on top of older griefs the country barely understood. That is what makes Rose Kennedy so eerie as a historical figure. She did not simply become the grieving mother of a murdered president. She became that after already living through the destruction of Rosemary, the death of Joe Jr., and the death of Kathleen. By the time the public fixed her in memory as the dignified mother at the center of national mourning, she had already spent decades learning how to absorb loss without allowing it to publicly dismantle the family image. And this is where the word dignity becomes complicated. Because dignity can be noble, it can also become a form of suppression. The same emotional discipline that allows someone to survive repeated grief can also keep them from naming the truths inside it. Rose's poise made her seem almost invulnerable in public, but perhaps that same poise had long made honest reckoning inside the family more difficult. A family built on composure is often very good at functioning through pain. It is often much worse at admitting what the pain means. After John's death, the Kennedys were no longer merely admired. They were sanctified by grief. The assassination transformed them into a family the nation mourned with, projected onto, and mythologized. Rose Kennedy's suffering became publicly visible in a new way. But even here the mythology simplified her. It turned her into the stoic mother of tragedy, a woman of faith and endurance, who somehow bore history's cruelty with grace. There is truth in that image, but it also hides the darker question beneath it. What had this family already been doing to itself long before the cameras arrived? The repetition of loss made that question harder to ignore. Because 5 years later, Robert F. Thayer, Kennedy was killed too. If John's death gave the family its national martyr, Robert's death gave the story something even more devastating: repetition. 1. Assassination might be history's cruelty. 2. Begins to look like a pattern. By the late 1960s, the idea of the Kennedys as a family marked by extraordinary suffering had hardened into something almost literary. Robert had become a figure of moral seriousness after John's death, a man many believed had been changed and deepened by grief. For some, he seemed like the family's chance at redemption, or at least continuation with meaning. Then he was shot in Los Angeles in 1968, and whatever remained of the illusion that the family could simply outgrow its wounds collapsed again in public. Now imagine that from Rose Kennedy's perspective. Another son, another public death, another future cut short, another wave of national grief projected onto a family already hollowed by private grief. By this point, tragedy was no longer an event the Kennedys suffered from time to time. It had become the atmosphere around them. It followed them into every public appearance, every act of ambition, every survival. Every remaining child now lived not only as an individual, but as someone standing in relation to the dead. This is one of the reasons the idea of a Kennedy curse became so hard to shake. People reach for the language of curses when ordinary explanation starts to feel emotionally insufficient. But the more grounded truth may be even more disturbing. Families do not need supernatural doom to produce recurring tragedy. They only need a pattern of pressure, secrecy, symbolic role assignment, emotional containment, and a belief that greatness matters enough to justify almost any internal cost. Once that pattern is in place, each new disaster feels less random, even when the circumstances are different. Edward Kennedy, the youngest son, inherited the full weight of that atmosphere. By the time Ted emerged as the surviving political standard-bearer of the family, he was no longer simply another promising Kennedy son. He was the vessel left standing after too much collapse. He carried the shadow of his brothers, the expectations of the dynasty, and the impossible burden of representing continuity after repeated catastrophe. He would become a major political figure in his own right, but his life too would be marked permanently by darkness after Chappaquiddick in 1969, when Mary Jo Kopechne died after Ted drove off a bridge. And once again, Rose Kennedy was there to witness it. This is what separates her from almost any other political matriarch of the century. She did not live through one defining grief and then recede into old age. She lived through an accumulation so severe that it transformed her family into national myth while she was still alive to see it happen. She watched the Kennedys become symbols not just of ambition and glamour but of loss. She watched the family's name gather meanings beyond anyone's ability to control: martyrdom, secrecy, privilege, pain, scandal, destiny, collapse. And the daughters, even when they did not die violently, did not escape the family atmosphere either. Eunice Kennedy Shriver perhaps offers the clearest example of how one sibling's tragedy could reshape another sibling's purpose. Her later work with the Special Olympics gave the family one of its most meaningful public legacies, and that work cannot be separated from Rosemary. In a sense, Rosemary's suffering echoed forward through Eunice's life as a form of transformation. Something constructive came out of something devastating, but even that hopeful thread does not erase the original wound. It confirms how central it was. Rosemary's fate was not a side story. It changed the emotional architecture of the family. Patricia Kennedy's marriage to Peter Lawford brought Hollywood closeness and glamour, but also strain, fracture, and disappointment. John Kennedy would live long enough to become one of the last direct witnesses to the old family world. Each child carried the Kennedy identity differently, but none of them existed outside it. None had the luxury of being ordinary people shaped only by their own preferences and limits. They were born into a family project, and whether they succeeded, suffered, adapted, or collapsed, they did so under that pressure. That is why it is too simple to tell this story as a list of tragedies. Joe Jr. dies in war. Kathleen dies in a crash. John is assassinated. Robert is assassinated. Ted is scarred by scandal. Rosemary is hidden after a disastrous procedure. Those facts matter, but the deeper story is what connects them. Not in the crude sense that one event caused all the others, but in the subtler sense that they all unfolded inside the same family culture, a culture of expectation, a culture of control, a culture that assigned symbolic meaning to each child and demanded performance under extraordinary pressure. A culture where the family's identity could become more important than the well-being of the individual inside it. And Rose Kennedy stood at the center of that culture. Not alone, of course. Joe Kennedy's ambition and will were central to it. But Rose gave the family something equally powerful: structure. She represented refinement, order, ritual, dignity, discipline, Catholic moral seriousness, and the emotional style through which the family learned how to carry itself. She helped make the Kennedys appear inevitable. She also helped create the atmosphere in which admitting weakness became so difficult. That is why she remains such a difficult figure to judge cleanly. There is something undeniably formidable about her. She endured more than most people can imagine. She kept standing. She maintained composure across decades of private catastrophe and public scrutiny. But that same endurance can also be read another way, not merely as strength, but as a form of armor so complete that it protected not just the self, but the system itself. The family kept functioning. The image kept holding. The myth kept growing, even when one child had already been sacrificed to preserve it. And that is where the story starts to shift again. Because once you move beyond the big public events and return to the emotional structure underneath them, the real question is no longer just what happened to Rose Kennedy's children. The real question becomes what kind of family could produce so much brilliance and demand so much cost in return. That question hangs over everything that comes next. It changes how you see the famous photographs, the family mythology, the public grief, and even Rose herself. She is no longer simply the mother of a tragic family. She starts to look like the surviving witness to a dynasty that achieved nearly everything ambition could want, except peace. And in the final part of the story, that is what matters most. Not just the losses themselves, but what those losses reveal about the family Rose Kennedy helped build, the roles her children were forced to play inside it, and the unsettling possibility that the public curse everyone later talked about had a private beginning much closer to home. Rose Kennedy lived to be 104 years old. That fact matters more than it first appears, because it means she did not just witness the rise of her family. She witnessed the transformation of that family into legend, then into mourning ritual, then into something darker and more complicated than legend had room to admit. She lived long enough to see the Kennedy name become one of the most famous in the world. And she lived long enough to watch that name gather meanings that no family would ever choose for itself. Power, beauty, privilege, violence, scandal, burial, reinvention, loss. By the end of Rose Kennedy's life, the family she had helped build was no longer simply a family. It was a national symbol. And symbols are dangerous things because the bigger they become, the easier it is for the truth inside them to disappear. That is really where this story ends. Not with one tragedy. Not with one funeral. Not even with one child. It ends with the question of what the Kennedy family actually was underneath the myth. Because once you strip away the polished photographs, the presidential glamour, the social prestige, and the language of destiny, something harder comes into focus. Rose Kennedy's children were not tragic only because history was cruel to them. They were tragic because they were born into a family system that demanded excellence, feared weakness, and placed enormous value on image, control, and continuity. That system produced brilliance. it also produced damage. And the most haunting part is that those two outcomes may never have been fully separable. That is why Rosemary matters so much in the final reading of The Family. The story is not simply one sad chapter among many, it is the hidden chapter that changes the meaning of everything around it. Before the world saw John become a martyr, before it saw Robert cut down, before it watched Ted stumble under the weight of survival, there was already one Kennedy child who had effectively been sacrificed to preserve the family's shape. Rosemary was the first child whose life revealed, in the clearest and most brutal way, what could happen inside a dynasty when a person no longer fit the design. And once that truth is visible, the rest of the story starts to feel less like random curse and more like fallout. That does not mean Rosemary's lobotomy caused Dallas. It does not mean one family decision somehow directly created every later disaster. The story is more subtle than that, and more disturbing. It is that Rosemary's fate exposed the family's deepest logic very early. Image had to be protected, weakness had to be contained, and the larger mission had to continue. Once you recognize that logic, later tragedies begin to look different. Joe Jr. was not just a son lost in war. He was the first chosen heir, carrying the burden of the father's dream. John was not just a handsome younger brother who happened to become president. He was the son who stepped into a role created by loss and expectation. Robert was not just another brilliant brother. He was a man shaped by the emotional wreckage of his family and drawn into history under its pressure. Ted was not just the last surviving son. He was the one left to carry the ruins, and Rose was there for all of it. That is what makes her such a difficult figure to place emotionally. It would be easy, and probably comforting, to reduce her to one clear thing. To call her simply a great mother destroyed by grief, or to call her cold and complicit and leave it there. But the reason her story lasts is that neither version feels complete. She seems to have been both formidable and emotionally remote, loving and severe, wounded and protective of the very system that wounded her children. Her strengths were real. Her endurance was real. Her faith was real. But so was the silence. So was the family structure. So was the awful fact that after Rosemary's life was devastated, the family's public image remained polished enough to keep ascending. That contradiction is the center of her life. Rose Kennedy was not just the mother of a tragic family. She was the keeper of a family order that could not easily admit how tragic it already was. And that changes the way the later years of her life should be understood. Old age did not simply bring memory. It brought accumulation. By then, Rose was no longer just remembering individual children at different stages of life. She was living in the aftermath of an entire family narrative that had gone public. John was not simply her son anymore. He was an American icon. Robert was not just another son. He was another interrupted possibility. Rosemary was not just the daughter who had once struggled. She had become, retrospectively, one of the most haunting figures in 20th century family history. Ted was not merely the youngest. He had become the flawed survivor of a dynasty that seemed unable to escape its own shadow. Imagine what that does to memory. Imagine what it means to age inside a story that strangers keep retelling in larger and larger terms, to have private grief constantly translated into public mythology, to know details no one else knows, to remember versions of your children untouched by legend, while also knowing that the world now sees them mostly as symbols. That is what happened to Rose Kennedy. She became the surviving witness, not only to her family's losses, but to their conversion into narrative. And narrative always simplifies. It turns families into archetypes. It turns people into roles. It turns years of complicated emotional life into a set of images that can be remembered quickly. The perfect mother, the hidden daughter, the assassinated son, the cursed family. But the truth is more unsettling than that, because the truth suggests that the family's private problems were never separate from its public greatness. They were part of the same structure. The discipline that made the family appear so strong may also have made tenderness harder. The ambition that drove the sons toward history may also have made failure unbearable. The reverence for order that gave Rose her composure may also have made silence easier than honesty. These are not side notes to the Kennedy story. They are the architecture of it. That architecture is why so many people keep coming back to this family long after the major events are over. On the surface, the Kennedys are irresistible because they offer scale. Great wealth, great politics, great beauty, great grief. But underneath that spectacle, they also offer something uncomfortably familiar. The favored child, the hidden child, the role no one chose but had to fill. The family secret that never gets spoken directly. The pressure to look perfect while something inside is already breaking. The Kennedys are just a magnified version of dynamics many people recognize in smaller forms. That is why the story never feels entirely distant. It feels like an American dynasty and a private household at the same time. Rose Kennedy sits at the center of that overlap. She represents both the grandeur and the cost, the success and the silence, the elegance and the emotional chill. If you want to understand her as a tragic figure, that is the only way to do it honestly. Not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a woman whose best qualities and worst consequences may have grown from the same root. Her discipline helped build the family. Her endurance helped preserve it. Her commitment to form gave it shape. But those same things may also have made it harder for one daughter to be loved outside the terms of performance, and harder for the family as a whole to stop and ask what it was becoming. And that may be the darkest part of the story. Not that the Kennedys suffered, but that they may have understood suffering mostly in ways that still served the dynasty. A death could be absorbed into meaning. A scandal could be managed. A role could be reassigned. A child could be hidden. The family kept going. The image held. The mission survived. That is not just resilience. It is something colder. By the time Americans began speaking casually about the Kennedy curse, the private pattern had already done its work. The phrase curse makes the story sound mystical, even glamorous in a dark way. But what if the truth is less supernatural and more human? What if the thing people kept recognizing as a curse was really the visible consequence of a family built around ambition, hierarchy, suppression, and symbolic roles? What if the reason the tragedies felt connected was not magic, but structure? That possibility is more disturbing because it suggests that the family's grandeur and damage were never separate tracks. They were the same track seen from different angles. And once you understand that, the famous Kennedy photographs change forever. They are still beautiful. They still carry the old money charm, the youth, the confidence, the exquisite arrangement of posture and clothing and setting. But they stop feeling innocent. They start to feel brittle. They start to feel like evidence of how much was invested in appearances. In some of those photographs, Rosemary is still there, smiling, dressed beautifully, part of the lineup. And when you know what came later, the image becomes almost unbearable, because you can see what the world saw and what the family would later refuse to fully show. That is the image that lingers, not the White House alone, not the funeral procession alone, but the family portrait before the myth has fully hardened, when everything still looks whole from the outside and the first terrible compromise is either already underway or waiting just beyond the frame. That is where the real darkness lives. The tragedy of Rose Kennedy's children was never just that so many of them suffered. It was that they were raised inside a system where individual pain could be subordinated to family meaning. Rosemary bore that first and most brutally. The others bore it in different ways, through expectation, substitution, pressure, exposure, and the emotional cost of carrying the family myth forward after each collapse. Rose outlived enough of them to watch the pattern become undeniable. So in the end, her story is not only the story of grief, it is the story of what a family can become when children are treated, not just as children but as extensions of legacy. It is the story of what happens when weakness is feared more than it is understood. It is the story of a mother who seemed to embody perfect control and of the possibility that control itself was part of the tragedy. And it is the story of a dynasty that achieved almost everything ambition could ask for, except peace. They got the status, they got the power, they got the White House, the headlines, the marriage into myth, the place in history, but history did not protect them, and family structure did not save them. If anything, the very qualities that made the Kennedys so dazzling may have made them more vulnerable to becoming the kind of family that looked magnificent in public while slowly breaking under the weight of its own expectations. That is why the story still grips people. Not just because of JFK, not just because of Rosemary, not just because of assassinations, scandals, and funerals, but because the family once looked like the cleanest possible version of the American dream. And the closer you look, the more it seems that one of the dream's hidden costs had been there almost from the beginning. The public curse came later. The private one was already at home.